hailed as the world's last best hope. Leaders gather in Glasgow to take on the climate crisis. Should we expect more empty promises, or will the planet's most powerful finally take serious action? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is COP26. Well, since the Industrial Revolution, the planet has warmed by at least 1.1 degrees Celsius. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but if it continues at this rate, it won't be long before billions of people lose their homes. Over the next 2 weeks, leaders from around the world are in Glasgow as they debate how best to tackle what is arguably the greatest challenge to our survival. But ahead of the highly anticipated UN climate change conference, Greta Thunberg, one of the world's best-known climate activists, warned she is not expecting much.
My expectations is that we will hear many nice speeches. We will hear many pledges that, if you really look into the details, are more or less meaningless. But they just say them in order to have something to say, in order for media to have something to report about. Since they don't really receive any follow-up questions, they can say almost whatever they want. So that I expect, and then I expect things to continue to remain the same, pretty much as it is now, if they do not receive any big public pressure from the outside. So that's what I expect.
The climate emergency is a global problem, and to truly tackle it, everyone has to contribute. But at the same time, not everyone is equally to blame for this man-made disaster. So who are the planet's biggest polluters? Well, in the latest data from 2019, the top spots went to the world's two biggest economies. At number one, China produced close to 30% of all global emissions, releasing more than 11 billion tons of carbon dioxide that year. Next in line, the United States, releasing just over 5 billion. The next biggest culprits were the EU with the UK, which released more than 3 billion. Now, India followed with just under 2.6. And at number 5 was Russia with almost 1.8 billion tons. But that doesn't paint the whole picture. If we look at the numbers per capita from these 5 nations, the US is by far the biggest culprit, producing almost twice as much CO2 as China. Well, those big polluters are at the very least being represented in Glasgow, but will they actually change their ways? To discuss that and much more, I'm joined now from Perth, Australia, by Peter Newman. He is a professor of sustainability at Curtin University and also an advisor to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dann Mitchell is a climate science professor at the University of Bristol. And in Glasgow's philosophy professor, Rupert Read, a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and author of This Civilization is Finished. Thanks all so much for being with us. Rupert, let me start with you. You're in Glasgow, and like so many others, including Greta Thunberg, you are truly managing expectations here, because you've actually said leaders have had 25 opportunities to get this right, and they've always gotten it wrong. So you're basically thinking with COP26 that bad is the best we can do, but it's better than terrible.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can perhaps hear in the background, I'm coming to you direct from the conference centre. The heir to the British throne, Prince Charles, is speaking right now to the world's leaders. And, you know, I hope that they do something extraordinary and prove me wrong. But I believe that the chances of that are, to put it mildly, extremely remote. I am expecting that at best for us to come out of this with a bad, inadequate agreement. And I actually believe that the most important thing about COP26 is probably not what the leaders are going to agree. It's going to be how the world responds. The opportunity we have as people, as citizens, is to pivot from the world leaders failing us, because that's what's going to happen here, to actually taking matters into our own hands more. What do I mean by that? I mean we need to rise up more. I'm totally with my friend and colleague Greta Thunberg about that. We need a movement which is much bigger, even than Fridays for Future has been, impressive though it has been. And we need to get active and make changes in our communities, in our workplaces. We cannot wait for governments to show sufficient leadership on this, because they just aren't going to do so.
Okay, so it falls down mostly to the consumers of this planet. We'll have to see if they get the message.
I would say citizens, I would say employees.
We're all
Consuming is,
consumers, though, whether we like it or not.
yeah, but it's not the most important aspect of our lives, actually.
Mm.
Our labor is more important, vote is more important.
Okay, let me turn to Dan. You know, you've actually pointed out that there has been progress before via cooperation in the past. You know, the massive hole in the ozone layer is actually recovering because various countries worked together. Tell us, what did they do then, and why can't they do that now?
Well, exactly. So, the ozone hole is a very different problem, although it's still environmental. It's also a much easier problem to solve, and so that was half of the solution. It was just easier. The other half was we had readily available solutions to replacing what was causing the ozone depletion. Although we know what that is now with climate change, it's essentially green energy, changing lifestyles. It's not as easy to implement that. And the reason it's not as easy to implement is because it significantly impacts our lives, whereas with the ozone hole, the changes didn't significantly impact our lives. So that's the challenge, and that's why there's a lot of pushback.
Right. And Peter, I mean, one can understand, you know, China's complaints of hypocrisy in particular by looking at the numbers that we actually just showed. The United States built so much of its wealth and prosperity on polluting industries, and it's still among the highest per capita polluters in the world. Washington, though, now seems to have more progressive leadership, but it still comes back to asking less wealthy countries to cut their output while wealthy economies are allowed to kind of stay on top. Does it not?
Yeah, I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think America, not everything can be managed from the top there, the same as in Australia. Most of the action in federations like ours happens at state level. They have the power to manage energy and land and transport and agriculture. These are the things that need to change. And in America, there are many states that are way ahead of what the federal government have announced, and certainly in Australia as well. And we've got conservative governments in some of our states who are fully into 50% by 2030 and, of course, 100% by 2050. And that kind of commitment has been there for 5 or 10 years. So we've got some progress, but you don't see it on this national level. The national levels are pretty much the worst thing you can imagine going on out there. So I can see why Rupert gets pretty depressed and, the civilization's finished. There's a lot more happening at lower levels, I think, and that's what we can see as being some hope.
Right. I'll tell you what, I want to get some more perspective right now on actually what needs to be done to effectively cut global carbon emissions. Back in 2015, 192 nations signed the Paris Climate Accord and agreed to limit global heating by 1.5 degrees Celsius. But according to the UN report published in August, at the current rate, we'll hit that number in 2 decades. But scientists say if we want to change course, we have to cut emissions by 7% annually until 2030. Now, to put that into perspective, when the world basically locked down during the coronavirus pandemic, emissions fell to just 6%. Dan, let me go to you. That was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shut down emissions almost entirely, and it didn't even meet the basic requirement laid out by the United Nations for that 7%. So how is it possible to consistently hit 7% every year to get to where we want?
Yeah, well, exactly. We need much better investment in green technology, and that's where to slightly disagree with Rupert earlier. Although yes, it is the people at home that need to act. We do need the governments on board, and we do need them working together because they are the ones who can invest in these green technologies. They can make them feasible for people like us to use. And as an example, for me to get to COP, and I'll be going next weekend, it's 1 hour flying, £45 return, or it's 8 hours on the train, £330 return. Now, I'm lucky I can take that time and I can spend that money, but many people can't do that. And we need the investment from the governments to really change, our infrastructure so it is much easier to do that. I was talking with an MP a couple of days ago, and she turned up late to our meeting. And the reason she turned up late is because her battery-powered car ran out of energy because there wasn't enough charging points. We need this infrastructure, and it has to be government-backed for us to be able to make these actions.
Right. And Rupert, I know you were saying that comes down to also, consumers and us citizens putting more pressure on our governments, which is understandable. But listen, let me take one more point here. It's almost universally agreed, we know, that drastic action is required. And the cost of not doing enough is genuinely frightening. Scientists have been charting just how bad things could get. And I want to take a look at this. So should temperatures now continue to rise, a study in 2016 found that 13 million people in Miami could see a 6-foot rise in sea levels by the end of the century, causing catastrophic damage. Large parts of the Indonesian capital could become submerged by 2050, with 95% of northern Jakarta literally underwater. Now, an MIT study in 2015 found that by the year 2070, cities like Abu Dhabi could see temperatures hit a staggering 52 degrees Celsius on a regular basis. And by the end of the century, Shanghai, China will likely experience several fatal heat waves. Okay, let's get back to our panel now. And Rupert, I can come to you. I'm going to play the other side of the coin, because they're talking about these areas now becoming uninhabitable. But areas in the Gulf, like Dubai, were basically uninhabitable for large populations until air conditioning and saltwater purification became an option. So who's to say we won't find another way to engineer around these changing climates in the future? Because that's what you are really up against. Convincing people that we have to make these changes because there is no way to engineer our way out of this.
Yeah. So when I used to fly, I spent time in Oman and in the United Arab Emirates. Those countries are not going to survive in the way that they've been accustomed to surviving since the fossil fuel age began. There is no chance of that. There is no way they're going to be able to stabilize themselves against the kinds of growingly extreme weather conditions that you just described. And this is one small part of what I mean when I say that this civilization is finished. By that, I do not mean that everything is bound to collapse. What I mean is that this civilization shows absolutely no sign of doing the things that would be necessary in order to enable itself to survive. So let's take the example of air travel and rail travel, which Dan just mentioned. So in my country, the UK, the government has just slashed taxes on air flying, on air travel. I mean, it's completely insane. It's incredible that that's happening at this moment in history, but it is happening. And this is the government that is hosting the COP26 talks. If you expect the COP26 talks to deliver what is necessary, you are going to be bitterly disappointed. So part of the reason I speak out is to avoid that bitter disappointment. What I want to see is for us to change to a way that we can actually survive the future without our civilization collapsing. That is still just about possible. But in order for it to happen, everything will have to be changed, and a lot will have to be changed from the bottom up, because governments are not showing enough leadership and will not do so unless a lot more people rise up to force them to do so. So we can get through with our civilization transforming and without collapse, but only if everything changes. In other words, it won't be the same civilization that comes out the other side. It won't be using the same amount of energy. It won't be as centralized. It is as undemocratic as most of our countries are. The future is going to be very different. The issue is it going to be very different because we are scrabbling around in the wreckage of our civilization, or is it going to be very different because we voluntarily chose together to transform it? I'm still hopeful that we can go down the latter route, but there is very little sign of that here in Glasgow.
Okay, Peter, I'm going to continue to play the other side of the coin and put this to you. I mean, there were a number of doomsday scenarios over the last century saying, for example, that we would not be able to feed the world's growing population And then came the agricultural revolution, allowing much of the world to actually throw a huge amount of food into the garbage and still get fed. Again, who's to say we won't see some sort of technological revolution that will be able to prevent all the doomsday scenarios that Rupert has kind of been highlighting here?
Yeah, look, I think it is a bit over the top to say that nothing has happened, because just take China, for example. They have given us as a civilization three great gifts. One is in technology terms, that is. They've given us other cultural things too, but certainly solar energy was made cheap and available, and is now the cheapest form of power in the world. That came because they mass produced it and sold it to the world markets. Everybody now uses Chinese cells, mostly anyway. And then they did the same thing for batteries, and then they did the same thing for electric vehicles, and they're now coming right down in cost. So those three things together can remove 80% of greenhouse gases in our system. That's a massive change, and it is a transformative one. That's just technological, and governments can get in the way of this. They can stop it by talking up all kinds of ways in which you need gas for a transition fuel and so on. We can just get on with converting to renewables, electrifying everything, and using electromobility for all of transport. Then you will really get transformative change. And that is
Okay.
happening at an exponential rate.
Okay, Rupert, I can see you passionately shaking your head there. Go ahead.
What has just been said is true, but what has been omitted is that most of the energy that was used in order to accomplish those things in China came from burning coal, which China is still doing at an accelerating rate. So unfortunately, we cannot
Not
hold up China
accelerating.
here as an example of an ecological civilization, although it proclaims that it wants to be an ecological civilization. The brutal reality is that the huge exponential growth in renewable energy, which is hugely to be welcomed, has so far been additional to fossil fuel energy. It has not reduced it at all. And that is how we are still on a trajectory towards collapse. If we're going to change that, we're going to have to drastically reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we are using. And that means that there is not going to be a like-for-like substitution. You're not going to have the same amount of energy in the future, only it's all going to come from beautiful, shiny, new renewable sources. Remember also that renewables have very severe ecological downsides too, potentially. Look at the way that we're now talking about potentially deep mining, which would be catastrophic, in order to produce the batteries that are required for the so-called electric car revolution. The electric car revolution, if it tries to make the whole of the world as mobile as people in the US and Europe currently are, will simply accelerate our going off the cliff. That is why I say we have to be more serious in our thinking, in our transformative thinking, if we're really going to have transformative change. We have to transformatively adapt rather than pretending that we can simply substitute renewable energy like for like.
Okay. I want to let Peter respond, and then I want to get to Dan. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I agree that transformative change will require us to reduce our energy, to rebuild our cities in different ways, to bring about those sort of transformative cultural changes as well. And certainly no country, including China, has that in place. But I think your numbers are wrong. The transformation is well underway in terms of how renewables are replacing fossil fuels. Fossil fuel use is going down in most developed countries now, and certainly in China. By 2026, they will have gone over the peak there. So those numbers are pretty clear, and they're the sort of things we have to deal with in the IPCC. So it's a daily thing for me to look at that. It's not yet there, but we are getting close to the point where the peak is happening and we're going down globally. But most of the developed world has already peaked and is going down. That is not because they're just adding renewables. It's because it is replacing fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are on their way out, and we will accelerate it. And hopefully Glasgow will help with that.
Okay, let me get back to Dan. Sorry, I want to give everybody equal time. So Dan, I mean, I don't know, is your take quite as cynical? Because a lot of people are arguing that we are champions of adapting, and that what humanity has done with technology in the past, it can do again, and relatively quickly. We don't have to be this cynical about our future. What do you think about the exchange you just heard?
Well, to say we certainly can adapt, we know we can adapt, but is that the right way to do it? First of all, we know that adapting, and you've talked about AC and things, is extremely expensive. We know that this will cost a lot more to adapt than just to avoid it. So there's that argument. The other side is we certainly can't adapt to everything. In fact, we can't adapt to a large range of things. Sea level rise, we can't do too much about that. Things like heat and heat-related mortality, yes, we can adapt pretty well in rich countries. AC is one solution. Redesigning cities so the flow is better is another solution. That's not very easy to do in older nations like the UK, because we can't change our city layout. But the problem is there are large proportions of the world which can't do that because they just don't have the finance to do it. So the things we can adapt to, it's hard to adapt to.
Understood. But I mean, Rupert, the opponents of movements like yours will say that you just don't have enough faith in humanity. I mean, whoever would have seen Singapore as a financial capital of the world? And Lee Kuan Yew once said, the founder of the city-state, said the reason for our success is air conditioning that allowed development in the tropics. So again, why is it not possible for humanity to develop so dramatically on the other side of the equation, on the greener side of the equation, so that we can work our way out of this? Sure, governments have to make the changes as well, but are you not giving technology and human innovation enough credit?
Look, I would love to believe that you're right, but you said it yourself earlier. Even during the COVID pause, we didn't reduce greenhouse gas emissions enough. And we have to do more than that every single year to 2030. Now, I really want that to happen. And it's not completely inconceivable that it could happen if, for example, we get far larger citizen movements than we've had so far. And that's what I'm working towards. But to anyone who wanted to bet on that would be an extremely unwise person. What we need to be doing is to be trying to make the changes that are necessary and developing an insurance policy. So the way we need to get more serious about adaptation is transformative adaptation and, frankly, what's called deep adaptation, which means preparing for potential civilizational collapse, because that can no longer be ruled out. Don't take my word for it. You don't even have to take the IPCC's word for it. Take the words of JP Morgan, for example, the investment bank, who in a confidential report that I got hold of and leaked to the world's press last year said this, quote, "We cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes when where human life as we know it is threatened."
Okay.
Or the 2019 said, "Catastrophic and irreversible disaster is rising,
Right,
implying
Rupert.
potentially infinite costs." Yeah, that's the reality that we're.
Yeah, your connection's very shaky. We just have a minute left. Let me finish with Peter then. And I just want to ask you overall, for as many years as you have been studying this science and the planet itself, I mean, has it ever been this bad?
Well, I lived through the bushfires in Australia, and all of those examples you gave were a long way out and yet they were catastrophic. These bushfires were unprecedented. There's no question the planet is warming now, and we must do something. And I can get very depressed about that and see it as something that is beyond us. But I don't. I choose to be more hopeful because I do believe that hope brings about much more change than despair and depression. And I believe that this hope can be generated as we look at exponential change. The technology is now available and it's rapidly growing. If you look at those changes, instead of exponential decline that we've had to deal with before, this is exponential growth in the right technologies, the right renewable power and so on. And it's happening now because business is very committed to it. The world of finance is saying we won't give you money unless it's net zero.
Okay.
And governments are slowly catching up. I don't think that it is all dependent on Glasgow, but I certainly hope that they can get behind it a little more than they are now.
Rupert, I know you'd like a final word, but we are very unfortunately out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. And our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @_Newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.